My name is Celine William. I'm 29. I was flat on my back in the ICU when my husband set a folder on the tray table like it belonged there. The room was dim except for the monitors. Every few seconds, something beeped, steady and indifferent. I couldn't lift my head more than a few centimeters, and I couldn't feel anything below my waist at all. My legs were there. I could see the outline of them under the sheet, but they might as well have belonged to someone else. If your partner walked away while you were helpless, would you ever forgive them? Tell me in the comments. He stood on the right side of the bed, so I had to turn my eyes, not my neck, to see him. He was wearing the jacket he usually saved for meetings. The folder was thick, clipped shut, a yellow tab sticking out the top. I tried to shift my feet. Nothing happened. "Can you sign these?" he asked, already opening the folder. His voice stayed level, like he was checking off a task before lunch. A nurse was adjusting an IV line near my arm. She glanced at the papers, then at me, then looked back down without saying anything. I asked him what the papers were, though I already knew. He didn't answer right away. He slid a pen out of his pocket and placed it between my fingers when my hand didn't close around it on its own. "It's a divorce filing," he said. "Everything's been filled out, you just need to sign." The word divorce didn't land all at once. It moved slowly, like the medication in my veins. I looked at him, then at the pen resting uselessly in my hand. "I can't move," I said. It came out quieter than I expected. He glanced at the sheet covering my legs. "Not for long. You can still sign." The nurse finished what she was doing and stepped back toward the door. No one stopped him. No one told him this wasn't the place. I asked him to help me sit up. He didn't. He adjusted the tray table instead, bringing the papers closer, tilting them so I could see the signature line. There was already a sticky note marking the spot. "I'm not doing this," I said. My throat felt tight, but my voice stayed even. He exhaled through his nose, like I was being difficult on purpose. "Celine, this isn't personal. I didn't sign up to be a caregiver. The doctor was pretty clear about your legs." I tried again to move them. I watched the blanket, waiting for it to shift. It didn't. He noticed where I was looking and gave a short, humorless smile. "They don't work," he said, "and that's not something I can build my life around." He tapped the page with one finger. The pen rolled slightly against my palm. "We should do this now," he added, "before things get complicated." The machines kept beeping. My heart rate spiked on the monitor, and no one commented on that either. I signed because my hand was guided, not because I agreed. He steadied my wrist while I dragged my name across the line, crooked and slow. When it was done, he closed the folder immediately, like the room itself might change its mind. He straightened, relief visible for the first time. "Good," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, he looked down at my legs again. "I hope therapy works out for you, but good luck walking." He didn't wait for a response. He took the folder and left the room without looking back. The door hadn't fully shut behind him before he came back in. He held the folder tighter this time, like he'd forgotten something important. A woman in scrubs followed a few steps behind him, tablet tucked against her chest. She stopped near the foot of the bed, eyes moving between us, clearly unsure where she was meant to stand. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "I need a witness signature," he said to her, just to confirm she signed willingly. The nurse hesitated. "She's still under sedation." "I know," he said, "but she's alert, you saw that." "Hospital policy only requires that she's alert and oriented," the nurse said quietly, not meeting my eyes. She glanced at me again. I didn't nod. I didn't shake my head. I lay there, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the small cracks in one of them while my heart thudded too fast for my body to follow. The pen was still in my hand. My fingers hadn't unclenched since he placed it there. "She already signed," he added, urgency creeping in around the edges of his calm. "We just need to finish this." The nurse tapped something on her tablet. "I can note that she appears oriented," she said carefully. She didn't say anything about willingness. He exhaled, sharp this time, and flipped the folder open again, scanning as if a line might have moved. "There's a courier coming later," he said, more to himself than to either of us. "I need this done today." I watched him pace the narrow space between the bed and the wall. His shoes squeaked softly on the floor. Every movement felt outsized in the small room. He checked his watch twice in under a minute. I said nothing. When he stopped, he leaned over me again, lowering his voice. "This is better for both of us," he said. "Dragging it out won't help your recovery." I blinked once, that was all. The nurse cleared her throat. "I'll document the time," she said, stepping closer to the bed. She asked me my name, the date, where I was. I answered because it was easier than not answering. When she left, the room felt quieter, even though the machines hadn't changed. He slid the folder back under his arm and finally looked at me properly, as if checking whether I might say something now that we were alone again. When I didn't, his expression tightened. "You'll get copies," he said. "My lawyer will handle the rest." He paused at the door, then added, "I'll have my office freeze the joint accounts, just temporarily, until things settle." The door closed before I could ask what temporarily meant. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed weakly on the side table. The screen lit up with a notification from my bank. I couldn't reach it, but I could read the first line. "Transaction declined." The monitor beside me beeped faster. No one came in right away. The phone kept lighting up on the side table, just out of reach. Each vibration was small, but in the quiet room it felt deliberate, like someone knocking without waiting to be invited in. When a nurse came back to check my vitals, I asked her to read the screen. She picked up the phone, her thumb hovering for a second before she spoke. "It's your bank," she said. "Looks like a declined charge." I asked her to scroll. She did slowly. Another alert, then another, different amounts, same message. She didn't comment, but her mouth tightened slightly. She set the phone back where it was and adjusted the blood pressure cuff instead. A few hours later, the hospital's billing office called the room. The nurse answered first, then handed me the receiver and held it close to my ear when my arm shook too much to keep it steady. They were polite, careful. They explained that my insurance information on file was showing an issue and that the copy for the imaging done that morning hadn't gone through. They asked if I had another card. I told them I didn't. After the call ended, the nurse stayed longer than necessary, pretending to straighten things that were already straight. She asked if there was someone she should notify on my behalf. I stared at the ceiling again, the same crack, same shape. "No," I said, "there is." Later, when the room was dark and the lights in the hall dimmed for the night shift, I tried to move my hand toward the call button. It took longer than it should have. My fingers felt heavy, uncooperative. I stopped halfway. It wasn't panic that settled in then. It was something flatter. A quiet understanding that whatever he'd started with those papers hadn't stayed on the page. It was already moving through systems I couldn't see, locking doors I didn't know how to open yet. I couldn't reach the call buttons. I couldn't reach my phone. I couldn't reach anyone. The machines continued their steady rhythm beside me. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time the machines beeped, my chest tightened, like something bad was about to happen again. A nurse came in around 3 a.m. and asked, casually, "Should I call your husband to update him?" I stared at her for too long before answering. "No," I said finally. She nodded and left, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the equipment around me. That was when it settled in, not as a thought, but as a physical weight, that I was alone now in a way I hadn't been before. Lying there with nothing to do, but weight made certain details harder to ignore. Our marriage had worked because it stayed light. We didn't argue much, but we also didn't ask much of each other. As long as things moved on schedule, dinners on time, weekends planned, bills paid without discussion, he was easy to live with. When something threatened that rhythm, he pulled back instead of stepping in. I remembered a winter 2 years earlier when my car broke down on the shoulder of the highway. It was cold, late, and my phone battery was dying. He answered when I called, listened, and told me to take a rideshare because he had an early meeting. He said it kindly, like a reasonable solution. I waited almost an hour for the car to arrive, shivering the whole time. When I told him about it later, he said, "It worked out though," and went back to his laptop. That was how it usually went. Problems were something to root around. Money was where he stayed most precise. He liked spreadsheets. He liked knowing exactly where everything sat. We split expenses down the middle even when his income jumped ahead of mine. When I suggested adjusting things, he said structure kept relationships clean. When I pushed, he reminded me whose name was on which account. I let that stand because it seemed easier than making it symbolic. What he never knew was that my family's finances didn't look anything like ours. I'd learned early not to lead with that. My last name opened doors I didn't want opened, and I wanted to know who stayed when there was nothing to gain. So I kept my work modest, my routines ordinary, my background vague. He knew my father existed. He didn't know what he owned. My father and I hadn't been close in years. Distance had settled between us slowly, then stayed. We spoke on birthdays, sometimes holidays. There were things neither of us knew how to revisit, so we didn't. I hadn't hidden that part from my husband out of strategy. It was habit by then. Silence felt safer than explanation. In the quiet of the ICU, it was hard not to notice how easily all of those choices lined up behind me, like evidence I hadn't meant to collect. I didn't know he was coming. The nurse woke me early the next morning to say there was someone asking for me at the desk. She said his name once, quietly, like it might not mean anything. It did. My father stood just inside the doorway when they brought him in. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, shoulders sloped forward, but his posture was still careful, deliberate. He didn't rush to the bed. He took in the room first, the monitors, the chart clipped at the foot, the empty chair on my husband's side. He asked one question, "Are you safe?" I nodded, that was all it took. He stepped out with the charge nurse and the woman from billing. The door stayed open, but I couldn't hear what was said. I watched their faces instead. The tightness I'd been seeing since the night before loosened. The nurse's shoulders dropped. Someone laughed once briefly, like a problem had been solved. It wasn't solved, not yet. The room emptied, but nothing actually changed right away. The billing issue was paused, not cleared. One scan scheduled for later that afternoon was quietly pushed back. A transfer request was mentioned, then set aside until administrative review. Even with him there, everything still moved at the hospital's pace. Slow, cautious, dependent on signatures I couldn't see. I stayed in the same bed that night, listening to the same machines, aware that if something went wrong before morning, I was still exactly where he'd left me. When my father came back, he pulled a chair close and sat down. He hesitated once, gripping the arm of the chair harder than necessary. His breathing caught for a moment before he spoke again. "I should have been here sooner," he said, not looking at me. "That's on me." He didn't touch me, he didn't apologize. He said, "Everything here is covered," and left it at that. After that, my husband stopped coming up in conversation. No one asked about him. No one suggested calling him. His name disappeared from the whiteboard by the door, replaced with my father's. By the end of the day, a transfer was arranged. Not to another hospital, but to a private rehabilitation center a few hours away. The paperwork was handled without being brought to my bedside. I signed nothing. I was informed. The move itself was quiet. An ambulance ride, a new room, windows that looked out over trees instead of a parking garage, equipment that didn't feel temporary. That night, my phone lit up once on the bedside table. An unfamiliar number, no message. My father's assistant removed the phone before it could ring again. "You don't need that right now," she said. I didn't ask who it was, I already knew. My phone was returned to me with a new number saved at the top of the contacts. My father's assistant. I noticed my husband's name was gone. I didn't ask where it went. No one told him where I was. It wasn't a confrontation. There were no messages sent, no explanations given. Access was simply closed. For the first time since the accident, nothing was being decided around me. It was being decided for me, and that difference mattered. The first floor of the estate had been converted into a quiet rehabilitation wing. The walls were pale gray, the floor polished, and every piece of equipment, parallel bars, treadmills, adjustable weights, was arranged so I could reach it from the wheelchair. There were therapists coming in at set intervals, each one careful not to overstep or speak over me. Even when I couldn't lift a leg or grasp a handhold, the routine was precise, predictable. Progress was slow. My legs trembled the first time I even tried to bear weight. My arms ached after the bars. Small victories, moving a foot an inch, lifting a hand an extra centimeter, were everything. The days stretched long, measured in repetitions rather than hours. One afternoon, my leg buckled without warning. I hit the mat harder than expected, air knocked from my lungs. I stayed there longer than necessary, face pressed into the padding, tears coming before I could stop them. When the therapist's hand hovered over me, I flinched and turned away, frustrated at my own weakness. Later, I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and tried again. Step by step, I forced myself to move. Calm returned, but this time it felt like something I had reclaimed, not something given. In the evenings, my father would appear quietly. He didn't hover, but he would sit nearby in the corner of the room, eyes on me. Each week, he seemed thinner. His breathing sounded harsher. One night, when I struggled to rise, he wheeled closer and said softly, "I won't be around much longer. Few months at most." I didn't respond right away. He watched the monitors, watched my attempts, then pulled a folder from the side table. "There's something you need to understand," he said. His voice didn't waver, but the lines around his eyes deepened. He explained the estate, the numbers, and the will. Everything I had expected to inherit was intact, but timing mattered. If I had stayed married, the division of assets could have gone differently. The divorce, cruel and fast as it had been, meant my husband had already locked himself out. He didn't make it dramatic. There were no lectures, just a quiet statement. This was his decision, his timing, and it was now mine to manage. I nodded, understanding that the weeks ahead weren't only about walking again. They were about preparing to take on everything that had been placed in my hands while someone else had abandoned me. He left after that night, and for the first time, the room felt like it was mine entirely, not just for recovery, but for control. A few days later, he came by with the documents I would need to understand. He didn't sit on the bed this time, he stayed in the chair by the window. "The estate totals about $8 million, he said plainly, sliding a folder across the table. "Cash, properties, controlling shares, it's all yours, but the timing matters." I looked down at the folder but didn't open it. He continued, quiet, careful with each word. "Because your divorce was finalized before my passing, none of it falls under marital property. Had it been otherwise, half could have gone to him. But as it stands," his hand rested on the folder, "he's already removed himself from the equation." I absorbed that. The theft of our joint account, the $50,000 he had taken, it was nothing compared to what he had lost by acting too soon. The anger, the urgency, the smugness of the hospital visit, it had all cost him more than he realized. He didn't linger over the irony. He didn't comment on my husband at all, except to note that timing and structure had protected what was mine alone. All of it, real estate, cash, shares, was separate property. No discussion required, no argument to settle. I finally opened the folder, leafing through numbers, addresses, and shares. It was meticulous, clear. Everything my husband thought he could claim was out of reach now, a silent consequence of his own decisions. I didn't announce anything to anyone. No posts, no calls, no messages. The outside world could wait. I had routines now, therapists, machines, exercises repeated until my muscles remembered something they had long forgotten. Each session was small, lifting a foot an inch, balancing on my hands, rolling the wheelchair down a short stretch of hallway without tipping over. Progress was measured in minutes, not milestones. I withdrew from the few friends who had checked in. The world beyond the estate felt distant, even familiar voices over the phone were distracting. Everything external, social media, news, casual conversation, was muted. The motivation was quiet, internal. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was a sense of ownership, of my body, of the life my father had entrusted me with, of control over the next steps. Slowly, steadily, I began to move. My legs trembled under weight. My arms ached from gripping bars. Every motion reminded me that nothing about this would happen all at once. But it was happening. The morning my father passed, I was practicing standing at the parallel bars. My father's nurse came in quietly, whispered my name, and when I wheeled over to the side of his bed, he was already still. His hand rested lightly on the blanket. No struggle, just quiet. The funeral wasn't crowded. He hadn't wanted it to be. I stayed close to the casket, felt the weight of the silence around me, then left when it was done. A week later, the family attorney arrived at the estate. We went through the reading of the will in the study, papers spread across the desk. He read line by line, confirming the transfers of real estate, liquid assets, and controlling shares of the business. Each item was designated solely to me. When the attorney got to the paragraph about marital claims, He paused. "There is no claim from your former husband," he said. "Because the divorce was finalized prior to your father's passing, all assets are your separate property." I didn't celebrate. I simply listened, filing each detail in my mind. The businesses, the accounts, the shares, everything my father had arranged were now under my control. I noticed the folder on the desk where my father had kept copies of prior communications. There was nothing about my husband. His absence, his impatience, the stolen money, all irrelevant now. It had been a temporary diversion, and it had cost him far more than he realized. I closed the folder, set it aside, and let the attorney leave. No one else was in the room. The estate was mine. By the time I returned to the office, I was walking with orthopedic shoes and a cane. My steps were measured, careful, but no longer dependent on anyone else. My arms had strengthened. My legs had learned their own rhythm again. I spent the first weeks reviewing operations, learning every department's workflow, and meeting managers one by one. Decisions weren't rushed. Every call, every meeting was deliberate. Within a year, I expanded several divisions of the company. Investments in new developments were approved, underperforming areas restructured. Contracts that had been stagnant were renegotiated. I didn't announce triumphs. I didn't call attention to my recovery or the change in leadership. The work itself was the message. By then, the attempts had grown more frantic. Missed calls turned into voicemails I never heard. Voicemails turned into legal threats filtered through intermediaries. Each message sounded less certain than the last, as if he was trying different versions of himself to see which one might still work. None of them did. Months later, I noticed his name in passing, not in person but in headlines. He'd spent the money he'd taken quickly. Luxury trips, fancy apartments, high-end cars. A new girlfriend, a new image, but it didn't last. The credit cards maxed out, the apartment lease ended early, the cars repossessed. Debt piled up faster than he could keep track of it. A business magazine ran a profile on Sterling Industries. I didn't seek it out, but it arrived in my inbox. My net worth, the expansions, the company's growth, it was all there. He saw it too, though I doubt he picked it up calmly. He realized, finally, the scale of what he had given up. $50,000 in cash, taken impulsively, meant nothing compared to the full estate, the controlling shares, and the decades of opportunity he'd walked away from in his rush to leave. It wasn't a sudden understanding. It unfolded in pieces: a call from a creditor, a story online, a friend mentioning the magazine, a legal notice. One afternoon, my phone rang. The name was familiar enough to make me pause. He spoke quickly, apologetically, almost like he was trying to convince me he'd changed. I thought leaving you was for the best," he said. "I wanted you to grow without me holding you back. I thought I was helping." I listened calm, letting him speak. There was no urgency in my response. When he paused, I told him what I knew. "You weren't helping," I said evenly. "You walked out, you took money, you tried to force a divorce in a hospital bed while I couldn't move. None of it was about me, it was always about access to what my father had. That's why you left." There was a pause on the line. I didn't fill it. Then he shifted. "Threats now. If you try to block me from any claim, I'll take this to court. My lawyer says." I cut him off gently. "Go ahead. You already signed your divorce. You've already disqualified yourself. If you want to try, we'll see each other in court." The line went quiet after that. I didn't argue, didn't elaborate. The facts were clear. The timing, the filings, the assets, they all spoke for themselves. He hung up before I said anything else. A few weeks later, the papers arrived. He had filed a civil suit, claiming he was entitled to half of my inheritance. The filing cited verbal promises, alleging that my father had once hinted at giving him shares. It also suggested that I had pressured him during the divorce, implying instability on his part. I reviewed the documents with my attorney calmly. There was no hesitation. No settlement offer would be accepted. The claims were baseless, and I was prepared to let the evidence speak. Depositions followed. He described the hospital room, his motivations, the divorce, and his supposed heartbreak. His version didn't match the records, the nurse notes, or the hospital security footage. When asked about the conversation in the ICU, my attorney presented the footage. I sat quietly nearby, observing. The recordings showed his exact words, his tone, and the nurse documenting the events. It confirmed the cruelty, the detachment, the purposeful withdrawal of support. Every lie he told in deposition unraveled under examination. Each claim of moral justification or emotional hardship looked smaller, less credible, against what had actually happened. By the time the first week of testimony ended, it was clear the suit had no foundation. The day of the ruling, I arrived at the courthouse early, sitting quietly in the back while my attorney organized the evidence. The ICU footage was played first. Every word, every glance, every pause was captured. Him telling me the divorce was final, his dismissive comments about my legs, the nurse documenting everything. Then came the excerpts from his mother's phone call, which the court had allowed into evidence. Her voice, calm but insistent, encouraging him to push me to sign, reinforced what the video already showed: coordinated indifference, not misunderstanding. The judge didn't linger. Each claim he had made crumbled under the weight of documentation. When the gavel finally came down, the ruling was firm. The inheritance remained entirely mine, fully protected as separate property. The case was dismissed with prejudice. The order included all court costs and my legal fees. The figure was substantial, $110,000, but precise. He slumped in the seat beside his attorney, pale, quiet. No words were exchanged. No gestures of protest changed the outcome. The collapse of his suit was total, procedural, and final. He had no claim, no leverage, and no further recourse. Outside the courthouse, he waited near the steps, shoulders hunched, hands fumbling with a folder. When he saw me, he stepped forward. "Please," he said, voice low. I need a chance to explain, to fix this." I stopped, looked at him steadily. "Our marriage ended the moment you refused to push my wheelchair," I said calmly. "Everything else after that was just you trying to take what you could while you still could." He opened his mouth, hesitated. I didn't give him another word. There were moments I could have pressed further, pursued additional charges, asked for more restitution, but I didn't. I had already gained everything I needed: control, clarity, and distance. I adjusted my cane, felt the strength in my legs, and walked past him, step after measured step. He didn't follow. He didn't call out. The courthouse steps became mine to descend, entirely on my own terms. The divorce, the betrayal, the money taken, it had all happened, and yet it had also freed me. I moved forward. Physically, I walked steadily. Professionally, I led. Personally, I kept the distance that mattered. The past existed only in quiet documentation, evidence of what had been survived and what had been learned. The separation, the loss, and the cruelty had become the mechanism that allowed me to step fully into my life. The world was ordered, the foundation running, and I was steady. Everything else, the remnants of what had once been a marriage, simply stayed behind.